What's up, Knife Tube? It's Diamond Cut Steel, and you guys are going to learn something today. And you're going to learn something about steel performance that you've probably never thought of. And that there's really no videos or write-ups out there to go read about or watch and learn. So, and if it's not something that you know from testing and use and testing and use, then you probably have never thought about this. I'm making this video because I get asked occasionally when I do a sharpening, and you see me on some steels or some knives, I'll cut the edge off before I do the sharpening. On some, I won't. And I'm asked why. Well, that's part of the reason why I'm going to make this video. The other part is because this information just isn't out there, and even though to some extent it's common sense, it's something that you've probably never thought of. And once you do think of it, or once you're told it and you understand it, then you're going, I wonder why I never thought about that. And then it will help your, I don't want to say sharpening, because it won't necessarily help your well, to some extent it will, but it'll help you get more out of your knives. Okay. So, there's a reason why I have these three knives on the table. There's a reason why I have these two cards on the table. The reason I have these three knives on the table is because they are similar geometry. Composition doesn't matter that much in this, but they're all significantly different hardnesses. This D2 knife is 6061 Rockwell. This, I don't know what the composition is. I'm going to assume something like 420 HC probably. It feels like it's like, on the stones, probably 55, 56 Rockwell, something like that. It's fairly soft stuff. Quite soft stuff. And then we have this, God only knows what it is, that's also quite soft stuff. It's easy to tell on the stones that this steel is softer than this steel, by a couple points probably. So if I had to group these, I would probably say 60-61, 55 to 57, 53 to 55, something like that. But we're going to do this. We're going to put this in a way to make it easy to remember. We're just going to say 60, 55, 50. Now, those are not right numbers, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that there's distinct hardness differences between the three. And with those distinct hardness differences, you have, how do I put this? You have different levels of rigidity at the edge apex between these three, just due to the hardness differences, not the compositional toughness differences, and not the compositional grain structure or microstructure differences. We're speaking specifically on hardness and how hardness affects how an edge breaks down. That's a good way to put it. Okay. Now, these cards here, they are about, as far as I can tell, they're exactly the same thickness. However, this is a stiffer, we're going to say stiffer, harder cardstock than this cardstock. They're very close in thickness. So, the reason that these are here is it's going to allow me to give you a good visual representation of something that is not thought about in how an edge breaks down. Okay. When you're cutting and you go back, your knife is dull, it's not stropping back, you take it to the stones, there's no damage to the edge, you're just going to start out on like a 600 or 1,000 grit, raise a burr, flip the burr, deburr, and go on about your business. Okay. And then you go out and you use that knife again. You have a brilliantly sharp edge. You go out and you use the knife, and the edge performs good, but it doesn't last very long. Yeah, man, that's a fresh edge. Why didn't that hold up? And that is what we're going to show with these cards. Okay. Think about cutting rope. Say you're cutting some 1/2 inch nylon boat anchor line. That's a fairly soft media that the knife is just going to dig in and cut right through without stressing the edge, the apex very much. Now, if it's dirty and there's silica and God only knows what in there, then yes, now you can have some abrasive dulling going on, but the rope itself isn't putting very much load on the edge. Now, say you're cutting some 4x thick cardboard that's stiff as hell, you are applying a lot of load to that apex, correct? Okay. When you're cutting through, whatever, where the hardness of the steel really affects how the knife dulls and how it fatigues is in this right here. Watch what happens when I push, say I'm cutting really stiff cardboard with, whatever, any of these knives. We're going to say this card here is this. Look at what's happening when I'm pushing down. And that's very little. That's very, very little pressure being applied. Now, what happens when you do that to metal? Okay, that's what's happening to your apex to some degree. To some degree. Now, on a harder steel, look what's happening. Far less, and I'm pushing even harder, but less deviation. Okay, all right. You should automatically know where this is going. That softer steel, when you're cutting through something hard, flexes, and there's more distortion around that apex, be it back, moving back and forth in small amounts, and as it moves back and forth, it fatigues, and it fatigues the steel structure that is around it, that's around the very apex. On a harder steel, even though it may not be a tougher steel, on a harder steel, you're going to have less deviation. Much less deviation. So think of bending a paper clip. We'll say this knife right here, you would be bending the paper clip like this. Like cutting through that thick cardboard with this knife would be like bending that paper clip like this. With this knife being just a little harder, and you're cutting that same cardboard, instead of it being like this, you're bending it like this now. And that same cardboard with this knife, and you're bending it like this now. What happens when you bend metal like that? If you bend metal like, if you take two pieces of very thin steel, or three pieces of very thin steel, and you bend one like this, how long is it going to take before you've fatigued that steel enough that you finally break it? Versus the next one, you're going like this with it. It's going to fail much quicker, correct? And if you had that same piece of steel and you're doing this with it, it's going to fail incredibly quickly, correct? Yes. Now, what also happens to the steel that's around where it finally fractures at? That steel has been stretched and fatigued heavily as well. If that's your knife edge and you're not cutting things that are abrading material away, abrasive medias that are abrading some of the material away as the knife dulls, then that fatigue steel just stays there. And it needs to be removed. On your harder steels, the amount of deviation that the steel, that the apex is seeing from its natural plane is much, much less when you're cutting harder objects than it would be with a softer steel. Forget about tough. Tough doesn't matter. This is specifically on hardness. The hardness determines how much, well, hardness and geometry, but keep in mind we're speaking all geometry being similar. So the harder the steel, the less deviation from it, the apex's natural plane that steel is going to see when cutting said media. The softer it is, the more deviation that will happen from that apex's typical plane. Its resting plane, where the apex sets on the edge. The softer the steel is, the more it will deviate from that spot when you're cutting things. And the harder and tougher things that you're cutting, the more deviation will happen. And the more deviation, the more fatigue that happens. And the further the fatigue reaches. Okay? So, say I've got this knife right here and I'm just cutting, cotton twine with it. Something that's not going to stress the apex at all. Okay? That very, very little fatigue is happening. So finally, when that knife dulled, I could remove hardly any steel whatsoever, raise a burr, flip the burr, you're good to go. Because what I'm cutting isn't stressing the edge enough to create fatigue. Now, say you're cutting thick, filthy cardboard. Well, that cardboard is stressing that edge and fatiguing that steel. However, the silicas and just all the different abrasive components that are in that cardboard are also removing some of that steel. So the dulling can happen from, that's the wrong words. Some of the steel is being removed by the abrasives that are within the cutting, whatever you're cutting. That can affect whether you need to, how much steel you need to remove. If you're cutting highly abrasive stuff, well, some of that fatigue steel is being removed as you're doing your cutting. So you're going to have to remove less steel. But basically, it's just a function of Softer steels, in my opinion, need more steel removed in order to maintain the cutting performance from edge to edge to edge to edge. The softer the steel, you're out cutting, lots of stuff, hard plastics, hard tough plastics, vinyl sheathing, hard, thick heavy duty cardboard. You're heavily fatiguing that edge. The softer the steel, the more area of fatigue there's going to be. The softer it is, when you're cutting, hard, tough stuff that's really applying a lot of forces to that edge, you're creating a larger area of fatigue. So you want to remove that, or you're not going to have consistency in performance from edge to edge. If you don't remove that heavily fatigued steel, your next edge is going to last not as long. And it will compound. It will absolutely compound. So say, you was cutting you got this steel right here. We're just going to use this. You got this really soft steel right here. You're out cutting a whole bunch of filthy cardboard and really hard rope that's dirty out in the garage, and you eat that edge up. You come in, you make grab your 600 grit stone, raise the burr, flip the burr, deburr, and go back out and get back to work. Well, you didn't remove that fatigued steel. You removed maybe a teeny bit of it, but not enough of it. Now the next edge is going to last not as good as the edge before it. You're out there working for another couple hours, you can, man, this edge is dead again. You run inside, do the same thing. You run back out, that edge is going to last less than the edge before it again. And each time you do that, you're allowing more fatigue steel to build up because you're not removing the fatigue steel in the first place. So it's going to get to a point to where you're basically going to have a large amount of, well, I mean, it's a very teeny amount, but you're going to have a large amount of steel that's near the edge that's all heavily fatigued steel. And it just fails very quickly. The harder the steel, the less this will happen, so long as the cut media is the same. So if that same cardboard and hard rope you're cutting in the garage, if you're doing it with this, you're going to generate a lot more fatigued steel than you would with this. Now, this may be less prone to microfracturing than this. That's another, symptom of a hardness variation and composition. But, keeping all things the same, minus hardness, yes, you may would run into more likelihood of a fracture with the harder steel. But we're talking about the maintaining consistent edge performance from edge to edge. So if you're the same exact cutting between this knife and this knife, or this knife and this knife, whatever, the softer the knife, the more fatigue the edge is going to see. So that heavy duty cardboard and hard rope, this D2 at 60 Rockwell may be able to stand up and have very little deflection and deviation of the edge as you're cutting versus the steel here having a lot, so you generate very little fatigue here, and you don't need to cut that fatigue steel off because there's very little there, and you're going to, just by raising a burr, you're going to remove enough steel to get rid of the fatigued steel. But on this very soft steel where you're having a lot of movement and it's constantly fatiguing more and more, you have to remove much more steel here than you would here. And so on this, if I was just going to slap a new edge on it, I may just go, 400 grit stone, raise a burr, flip a burr, I'm good to go. Finish on the 400 stone, I'm done. On this, I may have to actually go to a stone and remove some steel, because the cutting task that I'm doing with the knife is fatiguing the steel enough that I'm having to remove more than just a burr's worth of steel to remove the fatigued steel. If you're using a knife, and say you take your work knife and you sharpened it up, and it gets you through the week. By Friday, it's pretty dull. Saturday morning, you pull out the stones, get 600 out, sharpen, raise a burr, make some passes, flip the burr, deburr, back in your pocket. Now next week, well, you're at Thursday, and Thursday morning, and it's, what the hell? It got me through the week last week, and I doesn't even seem like I cut as much stuff this week. What the hell? Now you got a dull knife in your pocket. You get home, you throw it on the stones, you do the same thing, and now, you go to work Friday, it cuts good, and you're like, okay, it should get me at least until Thursday, because the first sharpening got me through 5 days, and now come Monday, you used it Friday, it cut good. By Monday afternoon, it's dull again, and you're like, what the hell? That is because you're not removing the fatigued steel. So, if you're not cutting stuff that stresses the edge, you're not going to fatigue the steel enough for it to really matter. You're going to remove enough steel and just a touch up to get rid of that steel, the fatigued steel. Well, that's what you want. That's ideal. You want your steel to line up to what you're cutting, and not creating a large amount of fatigued steel that you have to remove and burn up your knife blade quickly. So you always have to keep that in mind. You can either not remove the fatigued steel to try to save on steel. So you're just quickly raising a burr, flipping the burr, and that you're good to go. But you're not removing that fatigued steel. If you go that route because you want to save steel, you're going to be burning up a lot more steel, because you're going to be sharpening so much, because it's going to, all that fatigued steel left at the edge is going to be causing your edge to perform so poorly and go dull so quickly that you're going to be sharpening it a lot. So ideally, you're using a steel that is hard enough or has the geometry to suit the task to not allow enough deviation to create severe fatigue. And you're going to have to remove less steel, and your knife blade's going to last longer. So, always keep that in mind. Always understand that it's not always a burnt edge. A lot of times it can be blamed on burnt edges when it's not a burnt edge. It can simply just be fatigue. You had a factory edge, it wasn't burnt, I mean, all belt edges are fatigued to some extent. But you hear the term that, it's a burnt edge all the time. And on your first sharpening, that edge don't last worth nothing. Like it lasts less than the factory edge did, or about what the factory edge did. That very well can just be because you worked the knife pretty hard and you created a substantial amount of material fatigue, and you didn't remove that fatigue steel, and you needed to. Don't allow, if you're cutting tougher stuff, especially with the softer steels, you're going to have to cut the edge off to keep fresh steel there, unfatigued steel. The harder the objects you're cutting, and the harder the knife steel, you're still going to, that's the wrong way to say it. If you're cutting things that are seriously fatiguing your 56 HRC 1095 steel, and you go up to ZDP 189 at 64 Rockwell, you may not create hardly any fatigue on that much harder steel with cutting that media that heavily fatigued the softer steel, but may not be hard. It may not fatigue that much harder steel that's going to deviate less at all, or very little, we should say. But it's just it's not something that where you got to say, I need to pick the steel to well, I'm cutting harder stuff today, so I need to go to a harder steel. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, the softer the steel and the harder stuff you're cutting with that softer steel, the more fatigue you're going to create. The more fatigued area of steel you're going to create. And that needs to come off. So if you ever notice, and this, it doesn't matter if that you're using, M4 at 66 Rockwell. If you're cutting, tough stuff, hard plastic sheathing, really, really heavy cardboard, stuff that's really applying a lot of force to that edge, it is absolutely creating fatigue, even at that very hard steel. So, when you go to remove steel, you're going to have to remove a little more than you. This is how I do it. This is how I judge. Okay, did I remove enough steel? If this knife I know should get me through a week of work on an edge, and it's only getting me through 3 days, I sharpen it, that edge lasts 3 days, and I have to sharpen again. I know for a fact that means I didn't remove enough, that I left fatigue steel there. So I'm going to remove a little more steel on the next sharpening, and then bingo, now I'm back to getting 5-6 days on that edge. I start doing hard, tougher cutting tasks with that same knife, and now I'm getting back to 3-4 days. Then on the next sharpening, and all of a sudden now I'm getting 2 days, because I remember I'm cutting now. I'm doing cutting tougher stuff and more of it. So instead of it lasting me a week, now it's lasting me 3 or 4 days. But, you know, all of a sudden, now I'm only getting 2 days out of it. Guess what? I know that I'm having fatigued steel. This is exactly why every time you strop your knife back, each time you strop that edge back, that edge will last a little less than it did before. And over time, that compounds big time as well. Say normally you can strop your knife, you go to work 3 days, come home that third day, strop it up, you're good for another 3 days. After a few times, now you're stropping it up, and on the second day, at the end of the second day, it's starting to need to be stropped. And then, after a couple, 5, 6 more, 10 more times of stropping it back, now all of a sudden, now it's barely getting you through a day before it needs to be stropped back. And if you keep on, it's going to get to where the edge ain't going to hardly last at all. And then eventually it'll get to the point where it's so fatigued that you'll start having failure. Actual steel failure. Be it chips, rolls, pull, where the steel tears out just from it being over fatigued. In a case like that, an edge that's been stropped back many times, there is a shit ton of fatigued steel around that apex. So you cannot just razor burr flip. You can't just micro bevel that edge. Raise a burr, flip a burr, it's a 1 degree or 2 degrees higher than the pre-existing edge angle. And that edge ain't going to last at all. If you've heavily fatigued that edge and you create a micro bevel, that micro bevel is going to basically just go dull very quickly. That's because you have all that surrounding material that is heavily fatigued and needs to be removed. So, yeah, when you notice that your edges are not lasting, or after a sharpening you're not getting the performance that you should out of that steel, this is why. Sometimes it just requires you to remove a little more metal. You got to remove a little bit more of that steel to get back into fresh, clean, unfatigued steel for that edge to be able to perform again. And like I said, it will compound. The more you allow that steel to be fatigued, the more material surrounding that apex is going to become fatigued as well. And you're going to have to remove more steel. The more it's fatigued, the more steel has to be removed to get to clean steel. So, that's something a lot of people don't think about, but it's a very real part of edge performance. And I hope I explained it well in this video. If I didn't, if you're having a hard time understanding what I'm getting at, or it's not making sense to you, feel free to ask any questions and I'll go over it. To me, it's very difficult to talk without. It's very difficult to explain stuff without being asked questions. So, that's why I'm kind of all over the place when I'm doing these videos, because I'm not using any notes or anything. This is just me trying to explain it and stay, keep a fairly consistency in what I'm talking about. But without being asked questions, it's very hard for me to actually explain stuff well. However, you should have a general idea of what I'm getting at and how to correct it. But feel free to ask any questions. It will actually help me explain it better. All right, guys. Like, share, subscribe, and there'll be more content soon.